Welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know when new videos are available. I really hope you enjoy this one. Okay, so we've got 15 people on now. Let's get started since we're on time. Let's try to stay that way. I know sometimes I start a little late, but so last week, as we're going in depth through the RPA, what we were working on was the different types of buyer representation, right? So we're looking at the PSRA, which is the property showing a representation agreement. We're looking at the BRBC. We went through those in depth and then started talking about the RPA. And I know it kind of sounds a little bit like a broken record as we go through this, and it seems like it's every class that we talk about how the compensation works and what's required of you as a buyer's agent to be able to be compensated. But amazingly, I get asked nearly on a daily basis the same questions, and I see the same issues and mistakes. And it really makes me nervous that there are agents out there 6 and 8 months into this that don't understand how the compensation works, how we're to put it together, and how it affects our transactions. So last week we did talk about in the RPA adding the compensation. So I'm gonna pick up there and kind of recap it again, even though, like I said, it's a broken record. I feel like a broken record. We're gonna recap it again. And I know, for those of you that have already grasped this and have gotten it, I apologize that we're gonna we're gonna keep continuing to go through this. But I feel like in order for everybody to understand how this works and for there not to be any issues going forward, we've got to kind of review it over and over and over again. At least that's the way it's feeling from conversations I'm having, from contracts I'm seeing, from things that are happening. Okay, so while I'm trying to get my screen up, which is killing me that I think I accidentally closed where I was, so I have to start over again. But while I'm doing this, while I'm getting everything ready, anybody have any questions about anything? And right now, I don't have you guys. You guys can unmute, so if somebody has a question for the moment, go ahead and unmute, because I'm going to be typing away and looking at a different screen. So if you have a question, type unmute, ask the question. If not, bear with me for just a moment because I accidentally closed the window that I needed for the class.
I have a question on the listing agreement, Kyle.
Sure, Melissa.
Because it talks, well, on the disclosure regarding agency relationship, it talks about how the relationship you will have with your agent and your client, you has to be specified at a certain point.
Yes.
On the RPA, we see like when that happens.
Yes.
For the listing side, at what moment is it identified?
Well,
Is
but
it when
it isn't, because there's still a chance that you're acting as a dual agent. So if you were to confirm the agency as listing agent at that moment, then you wouldn't have the ability to act as a dual agent, which would then also cut out every other agent that works under the brokerage. So that's why there isn't a confirmation with the listing agreement there the way there is with the RPA.
Okay, so basically we find out it's open-ended until the RPA.
That confirmed agency, what our relationship truly is, isn't confirmed until there's a transaction, right? Until there's a purchase agreement that we're negotiating or agreeing upon.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question to kill some time while I worked on getting back to where I was supposed to be. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And there we go. You guys should be looking at the RPA and paragraph 3G3, which is where we left off last week. Everything loves to go to the other screen for me. And let's get started. So remember, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll get to that question as soon as I possibly can. And hopefully, and a lot of times when the questions come up in the chat or someone raises their hand, inevitably as we go through the form, we get to the answer to that question that they may have had. But don't hesitate. If you have a question, put it in the chat, or raise your hand, like I said. All right, so let's kind of recap a little bit where we left off last Thursday, and where that was this section right here, which is paragraph 3G3. Remember, as we're going through this grid format of the purchase agreement, all of this is paragraph 3. So when you're referencing something in a counter or in a conversation, it is paragraph 3, G2, G3, H1, H2. These paragraphs here to the right of that are just more detailed explanations of this paragraph, okay? All right, so we're looking at paragraph 3G3. This is seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. Buyer compensation affirmation. So there's two sections to this. The first section, this top half up here, is that seller agrees to pay out of transaction proceeds 2% or 3% or 1% of the final purchase price, and if applicable, any other amounts that may exist, like bonuses or whatever, or if checked, a flat fee towards the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker. So what that's reading is not that they're paying the buyer's broker, they're paying the buyer's agent to cover the obligation of the buyer compensating the buyer's broker. Okay, so in order to do that, this second section comes in where it says buyer affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with buyer's broker that is, number 1, valid, number 2, covers the property, and number 3, provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated above. So what that means is you're saying, as buyer, if I'm asking you, seller, to credit me this money, this 2%, 1%, 3%, 5%, whatever the amount is, I am saying to you, I am showing you that I have an agreement with this buyer's broker that I will pay them this amount, and not only will I pay them this amount, but the property that we're writing this offer on, that this transaction is going to cover, is part of the agreement that we have, and my agreement is valid. So here's the issue. I have to prove that, right? If I'm saying I am affirming that I did that, I have to prove that. The only way to prove that is by providing a copy of the buyer representation agreement, whether that be the more detailed BRBC, which is the buyer representation and broker compensation form, or it's the PSRA, which is the property showing and representation agreement, which is for short term, for very specific properties. It's not a more general sweeping coverage. So I have to show proof that it's a valid agreement, that the property does fit within the parameters set by that representation agreement, and that the amount of compensation I'm asking for is no more than the amount that the buyer has agreed to pay. Because whatever you guys have put into that buyer representation agreement is the maximum amount of compensation you can receive. So sometimes that feels like it becomes the hardest piece to understand for both the agents and the clients. I'm guessing if the agents don't understand it, I'm sure that the clients are struggling with that. Says that whatever you agree to pay me, whether again that be 1%, 2%, or 3%, that's the maximum amount I can make. So if I've done a buyer representation agreement at 1% because that my buyers say that's all they can afford to pay me, when I write an offer and ask for 2%, now I don't fit within these parameters. So in this offer, for example, we're asking for 2% from the seller because we either had a conversation with the listing agent or there was some kind of communication that said this was something that they would accept. But my buyer representation agreement was only for 1%. So if that's the case, then right here is Number three, my affirmation doesn't work, which means the seller now doesn't have to pay me. Okay? Doesn't have to pay that obligation. Zuli has her hand up for a question, so go ahead, Zuli.
Kyle, do I have to send the buyer's representation agreement with the offer or to escrow until we open escrow?
No, you need to send it with your offer. You need to send it with your offer. Whatever representation agreement you have, you need to send it with your offer so that you're showing proof of this affirmation that you've got a valid representation agreement that covers the property that we're writing an offer on and that the compensation is adequate. Okay, so you have to send it with. Have to. So that's, I think, where I'm getting at when I want you guys to understand this piece of this is that somebody's going to make a mistake and they're going to end up not getting paid and they're going to be upset. And there's nothing we can do about it. If you don't do it right, we can't fix it after the fact. If it closes with the incorrect stuff and you guys end up not getting paid or losing out on money or somebody doesn't want to sign something and agree to those changes, there's nothing we could do about it. Sarah, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Good morning, Kyle. Forgive me,
Good morning.
just to reference. So
No
on
problem.
my BRBC, on where it says amount of compensation, this is where I put the 2% that I need for my buyers to be credited. That's the same dollar amount that should be reflecting on the G3 of the purchase contract, right?
But yeah, well, I mean, at the most, it should be that amount because look, here's the thing. We've already had plenty of transactions where I have an agreement with my buyers to pay me 2.5%, 3%, and the seller is only willing to pay 1%. Right? We've negotiated it. Even if I ask for the 2 or the 3, the seller counters back and it's 1%. That's not an issue. The purchase agreement doesn't have to be the same amount as my buyer representation agreement. It just can't exceed the amount of my buyer representation agreement. So remember, this is all negotiating now. So you could ask for whatever you want to ask for. The seller is the one who has to agree to say, yes, I'm going to make that concession to cover the difference and or to cover that obligation. Or they could say, no, this is the maximum amount I'm willing to give you, which is 1 or 1.5%. Now, whether you choose to hold your buyer to that difference, the 1% or 0.5% difference that they agreed to pay you, that's up to you. That's a business decision for you. You can modify that buyer representation agreement so that whatever compensation you get from the seller is the maximum compensation you get. But we're finding out more and more as we go through this, and for the agents that are understanding how this works and can communicate it to their buyers, they're getting buyers to pay the difference in the compensation. Now, I know there's going to be some buyers that aren't able to, that don't have the ability to. I get that. But for those that do, having the proper conversation with them, I think you'll find more often than not that they have that 0.5 point that they can afford to pay you in your compensation. But that's, again, a business decision for you. Nobody's saying you have to do it. That's up to you and how you negotiate with your buyers. So again, I just want you guys to understand how important it is that representation agreement, number one, is done prior to showing property. Okay? That's that's number one thing I'm seeing with these representation agreements is nobody's filling them out prior to showing, and they're waiting until they have an offer, or they've even written an offer without the representation agreement, and the listing agent is giving you a heads up and saying, hey, I need this BRBC. That is the issue where you're going to run into, you're going to get paid zero because you're not doing things the proper way. Okay, so please, representation agreement prior to showing, whether that be the PSRA, BRBC, I don't care, one of those two, representation agreement prior to showings. Number two, make sure that are filled out properly, that they have the areas that you're looking at or the type of properties that you're looking at. And number three, make sure the compensation makes sense, that your compensation for the contract that you're writing the offer for does not exceed the amount of compensation that you've agreed upon. Veronica, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to be clear. So if my buyers agrees that they're going to pay the 2%, it's on the BRBC. So I do not click that, and by default, I'm going to get paid whatever says on the BRBC, correct?
Wait. One more time.
So let's say that during negotiation, the listing agent says that the sellers don't want to pay compensation, but my buyers agreed to pay me. Then my BRBC, I have a 2%, but during this filling out the form, I don't have to click on G3 by default. I'll get paid the 2%, right?
You'll get paid the 2% from your buyers if your
Yes.
buyers can pay it. Yes.
So I wouldn't click here and then by default I get paid the 2%.
Well, not by default, but yes, if once you submit your BRBC to escrow, then yes, there will be commission instructions that are done showing that the buyer is paying that compensation.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So now let's move on to the next part of the contract. I want to try to get through the contract. So with paragraph 3H1 is verification of all cash. So if I've written this offer as an all cash offer, it says in here in the contract, I have to attach a copy of my proof of funds with this offer. Okay. Down payment and closing costs. I have to attach my proof of funds to be able to cover the down payment that we've put in the offer and any closing costs I may need. Okay. The loan application. That's your pre-qual, pre-approval, right? DU, whatever. I have to attach that. That's what's required. Now, it does have a choice for 3 days after. But if you're writing an offer and checking 3 days after acceptance that I'm going to provide all these things, you're weakening your offer considerably. So just leave it as it is. Make sure all this stuff is attached, and then check the box for the correct verification of your loan application. Is it just a pre-qual where they've just said, yeah, based on what we looked at, they're going to qualify for this? Is it a pre-approval where they've gone a step further, or is it underwritten and ready to go and just waiting for an appraisal? Check off what it is. Okay. Pretty straightforward, but is there any questions about this? Let's see. We got something in the chat. If a buyer is paying 1% commission, can we ask the seller to pay 2%? No, we just went through that. The maximum amount of money the maximum compensation you can receive is whatever is in your buyer representation agreement. That's it. What is the difference between a pre-qual and a pre-approval? I mean, just my understanding, pre-qual is very cursory. Like, hey, we looked at their income. We looked at what they can afford and what their credit what their credit score is. Yeah, they'll qualify for this loan amount, right? That's just like, that's the ones that just people spit out, right? The lenders will give you. The pre-approval is we've at least sat down with them. We've gone through, we've looked at their income, we've looked at their debt, that kind of stuff. We just haven't sent it to underwriting yet. And then obviously the underwritten approval is when you have everything you need, it's done. It's just waiting for an appraisal. Okay. All right. Final verification of condition. This is the final walkthrough for the buyers. So we're at paragraph 3J. By default, it's 5 days. There is no really need to change that 5 days, but you could. I don't know why you would want to shorten it or lengthen it, but you could. But 5 days is fine. Please try your best as a buyer's agent to make sure you're getting the final walkthrough done 5 days prior to close of escrow. It's still, so many people are doing their final walkthrough like, oh, we funded and we're trying to do the final walkthrough before we record. If there's any issues with the property, now your buyer is forced to take the property in whatever that condition is, and then you have to fight after the fact. So this is why it's set up as a 5 days prior to. 5 days prior to, because generally we haven't signed loan docs yet. There isn't a fear of recording or funding. And so we have time, should there be any issues with the property, right? For us to be able to negotiate, to extend the escrow as necessary, to not be forced to close. But the thing is that your final verification of condition is not a contingency. Okay? So if you've removed all your contingencies, inspection, appraisal, loan, right? You've removed everything. And now you go to do your final walkthrough and there's something wrong with the property. Now, keep in mind, my final walkthrough is just to confirm that the property is in the same condition it was when we wrote the offer, that any repairs that were agreed upon in the midst of the transaction are completed. That's it. That's the final walkthrough. The final walkthrough isn't to go find new stuff. Now, if there is new stuff, for example, let's just say that we go to do our final walkthrough, the seller has moved out, and there's now a giant hole in the wall that wasn't there when we wrote the offer and we did our inspections or at any other time we're in the property. It happened at some point during the transaction and we didn't know about it and they didn't disclose it to us. Now, if I do my final walkthrough 5 days prior to close of escrow and I haven't signed loan docs yet, so I have time to extend the escrow, then I can go back to the seller and say, hey, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this hole needs to be repaired before we close. And we're going to extend, I'm sending you an extension of time. We're going to extend the escrow in order for you guys to complete this. Here's the thing. If the seller just says, forget it, they thumb their nose at you and say, we're not doing it, you guys got to take it like that. And you choose not to, you say, well, screw them. They're not fixing this hole they left there. We're canceling. There is still a good chance that you could lose your deposit. I know it sounds like counterintuitive and it sounds ridiculous that the seller is able to leave the property damaged and that you could lose your deposit, but because this is not a contingency, it's just a confirmation. That's why the time period is there for us to extend the escrow to continue to negotiate and do all those things. But if the seller puts a gun to your head basically and says, look, you've removed your contingencies, if you guys don't close and this cancels, we're going to hold on to your deposit. Ultimately, I'm not saying that they will win your deposit, but that deposit's going to be locked up and you guys are going to have to go through dispute resolution to try to figure it out, or at least it'll be a delay for you guys to fight back and forth over this deposit and getting it back. The other choice you would have if they don't do it is to close and then go after them civilly, right? You would close and then you would say, hey, this damage occurred prior to, here's all the documentation of us requesting for them to repair it and they chose not to, even though they were responsible. And then you could go to small claims or whatever it took to get that, your damages, get compensated for your damages for them leaving the property in that condition. But if we do that in 5 days prior and the seller goes, yeah, sorry, it was a mistake, we were moving out, we're going to take care of it, right? You get everything in writing that they're going to repair it, you extend the escrow to make sure they're doing it, go back, do your final walkthrough again to make sure that repair was completed, and then you can sign docs and close. But if I don't do it 5 days prior, so even if we go through that first scenario where the seller's like, I don't care, I'm not doing it, right? That happens. If we go through the second one, which is we have time to negotiate for them to finish the repairs, do all that stuff, extend the escrow, and then close once it's done, great. But the problem for us as buyer's agents is we put our buyers in a position where we're not doing the final walkthrough till they've already signed loan docs or till it's already funded and we're just waiting for the recording. Now there is no turning back, there's no pausing, and even if we could, it's very limited times. So we've put our buyer in a position where they may be forced to accept the property in that condition because the boulder's already rolling down the hill. So it's important for us as agents to make sure that we're doing it 5 days prior. And a really good indicator, as soon as your lender calls you, buyer's agent, and says, hey, we're ready to sign loan docs, tell them, hold up, let me try to schedule the final walkthrough, do the final walkthrough, then make your appointment for signing docs. Okay? And I know that sometimes it gets like really crunch time at the end because you've had extensions already, or you needed time, or if I don't close, they're going to try to cancel. I get that, but this is also where the communication between buyer's agent and listing agent comes in. And for you guys as listing agents, understanding that, hey, the walkthrough is part of the contract. They have a right to do that walkthrough before they close. And it's amazing to me how many times I get from our agents that an outside agent is saying, we don't have time for the walkthrough. You could do the walkthrough later. The other thing that I see is an issue, and we've got to get away from, is sellers remaining in possession, and the buyer's agent and the listing agent agree we're not doing a walkthrough because the seller hasn't moved out. That's just as dangerous as waiting till you've signed docs and recorded. The final walkthrough is the final walkthrough before I'm the owner. So even if the seller's living in there, I'm going and doing my final walkthrough to see what the condition of the property is before I own it. Now, do I want to check it out after they leave and that's all? Yes, but doesn't mean that I don't do my walkthrough before it closes, because once it closes, now it becomes an argument that did it happen before I was the owner when they were doing it and they're for sure responsible? Was it there and we didn't know about it because there was furniture in the way? I don't know. Or is it because they were acting as tenants? You still have to do a walkthrough before you close, even if the seller's going to remain in possession. So stop with that. We're not doing one because the seller's living there. No, you got to do it. Jasmine, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Kyle. Okay, so I had a situation like that, but it turns out that even if I had requested 10 days after the close of escrow for sellers to remain in possession of the property, it wasn't going to be enough, because the funds that we needed to close had to hit either escrow or the client's bank account in order for the docs to be released, because the upper leg was actually buying a property with the loan. So in other words, conditions had to clear. Once those funds hit the bank account or the escrow or get a final closing statement from the lower leg, they were able to send the file to final, have the underwriter review, sign off, get the file in line, all that stuff. And then after that, you're scheduled for final, you're scheduled to actually sign loan docs, fund, record, and then move out. So I counted the days, and it's pretty much like 2 weeks if you're dealing with a double escrow.
Okay, but you're talking about final walkthrough, or you're talking about the seller remaining in possession after close of escrow?
Seller remaining in possession after escrow.
Yes, you're right, and that's something that we'll talk about when we get there. But we weren't talking about that, so you just caught me off guard. I didn't understand what the question was.
I thought you were talking about that.
No, but yes, that's why it's a minimum of 10 days for seller in possession on a contingent sale. But I was like, I got confused because we're not talking about that yet, so that was weird. But thank you, Jasmine. Yes, if it's contingent, you got to do a minimum of 10 days. Minimum. Absolute minimum of 10 days that your seller's going to remain in possession.
Thank you, Kyle. Sorry about that.
That's all right. All right. So now let's get back on track. Assignment request. 17 days after acceptance, you have the right to request an assignment. Okay? So assignment is, I am the buyer now. I am either adding a buyer to, or I'm going to assign the total transaction to somebody else. I'm going to take myself out, put somebody else on. That's an assignment, right? And there's partial assignments, which are, I'm the buyer now and I'm adding another buyer. My partner and I are buying, I'm removing them, and it's going to be me solo. Those are partial assignments. Total assignments are, I'm the buyer right now, I am assigning it to somebody else completely, or I'm assigning it to my corporation totally. That's an assignment. The seller does not have to agree to allow you to assign a property. If I write an offer and the seller, well, first off, let's do this. We talked about at the very first time we talked about writing an offer, we talked about that buyer's name could be my name, Kyle Estrada, and or assignee. Now, if I write my offer like that, and or assignee, and the seller or the listing agent do not counter to remove that verbiage from the transaction, then the seller is agreeing that they'll allow me to assign it. Okay? So I'm allowed to assign the property. I just have to make that assignment within the first 17 days. Okay? Now, I'm going to bring up the assignment of agreement addendum. We're going to talk about it after we talk about this part. But if I don't have that verbiage in, if I don't have Kyle Estrada and or assignee, if I request an assignment in this first 17 days, the seller does not have to accept that assignment. Okay? They don't have to accept it. And on top of that, even if they've agreed to allow me to assign it, if the assignment is going to make me money, the seller can also disallow the assignment. So let's look at, I'm going to bring up the assignment agreement then, because I'm having conversations with people and Let me do it this way. And people don't understand how the assignments work. So let's add it. Let's take a look at it. So here's an assignment of agreement addendum. So remember I said there's two types of assignment. There's partial assignment, there's total assignment, and then there's other. Okay? So we got partial assignment, which is I'm adding. Total assignment, new buyer replacing all original buyers, and now they've added other assignment, which is we're replacing at least one of the buyers. Okay? Deleting a buyer, replacing a buyer. That's it. Here's the people that we're assigning it to. These are the names that are going in here. Okay? Or if I'm assigning it into my trust that I own by myself, I can check this off. Okay, to let them know that I'm just transferring it into my my own trust. Okay, here's where we talk about the prior documents. Assignee shall initial the first page of each document and deliver to seller all of the transaction documents previously approved by buyer, including but not limited to all contract documents, inspection reports, pamphlets, advisories, disclosures within the time specified below. Unless otherwise agreed, assignee acknowledges that all timeframes in this agreement remain the same and no additional time shall be provided for any matter, including but not limited to investigation, review of documents, or close of escrow. So what they're saying is, I have to, as the new assignee, I have to initial every document to acknowledge that I received a copy of it. My time periods don't change. So if I do the assignment at day 17 and it's time to remove the physical inspection contingency, there is no extension because of the assignment. It's time to remove it. Our close of escrow is 30 days. It's still 30 days. There's no extension because of this. Now, you can request and you can negotiate and you can do all those things. But here is the time periods for people to acknowledge those documents. Prior documents have already been delivered to assignee. Assignee acknowledges the buyer has already provided assignee all prior documents. That's the default, meaning that I've gotten everything, done the initials, done all that prior to us requesting this assignment. Or I haven't gotten them yet. The buyer's going to give them to me, and upon receipt of seller assignment, buyer shall immediately deliver to assignee prior documents. So what they're saying is, once you agree to this, then I'll show you that I've initialed and received them. Those are your two choices. My advice to you is, if you're asking for this assignment, that you do all that stuff ahead of the request for the assignment so it's done. Okay? Pre-qualification or pre-approval of signees. Assignee has been pre-qualified or pre-approved by buyer's lender as per the agreement, and a copy is attached. This requirement applies even if 1E is checked. So if there's a loan involved, you got to show proof to the seller that this new buyer is approved at the same terms. Okay, if there's a loan. Here's the assignee shall deliver initial copies of all prior documents to seller within 3 days after seller delivers to assignee a signed copy of this agreement. If 1E is checked, delivery and return of prior documents is not required because assignee is buyer's own trust. So if the person if the entity I'm assigning it to is mine, just me, I'm the only person on that entity, like the corporation or a trust or whatever it is. It's just me. I'm the only owner. I don't need to go through the process of initialing everything. Okay. Effect of failure to return attached documents. If I don't do it, the seller can send me a notice to perform, and then they can cancel on me if I don't do it. Now, I see already somebody asked, how would we know if you're going to make money or not? Because you have to disclose it right here. Consideration for assignment. Buyer has not received and will not receive any monetary consideration from assignee for this agreement. That's the default. The default is, I'm telling you, nobody's paying me for this assignment. Now, this is what you guys out there call wholesaling, where someone goes, locks up a property, goes and farms it out to all their other investors, and then they get some kind of finder's fee, $5,000, $10,000, whatever it is they make, and then they assign the property over to some other investor. If that's the case, if that's what you're doing, you have to disclose it, and you disclose it by checking this box. Buyer has received or will receive consideration from assignee in the amount of, and you have to disclose the amount. Now, I would guess that 99% of the assignments out there that are done with any kind of consideration between the assignor and the assignee are done with some kind of consideration being paid to the assignor from the assignee, and it is not disclosed to the seller. Does anybody know why someone assigning a property to someone else that's making money would not want to disclose it to the seller? Anybody have a guess? Want to raise your hand and state it? Or type it in the chat? Anybody have a guess? Well, it's because if I were a seller, if you were a seller, right? If you were, say, I agree to sell my house for $650,000, and then it turns out that you're making $15,000 by assigning the property to somebody else, and I'm still only getting $650,000, why couldn't I have gotten the $665,000 for my house? So you're now taking advantage of the people. And if you don't disclose it to them and they find out about it, then you're going to have some legal issues to deal with. Okay? Now, if I disclose it that I'm making $10,000 on the assignment, the seller goes, yeah, sure, I don't care. You got my house sold. I wanted it sold. Go for it. And they sign off on it. Not a problem. That's not illegal. It's the hiding it that is illegal. I mean, we had, we've had issues in the past years ago with agents that didn't do this properly. They got found out, and it nearly cost them their license, and it cost a lot of money to defend themselves. I've had arguments with outside agents that submit their own assignment agreements that don't state anything about whether or not they're going to get paid for those assignments. And I don't allow the agents to accept those. So you have to understand that if you're going to do this assignment, you have to disclose. I had a conversation not long ago with an agent that was purchasing a property in their own corporation and then wanted to assign it to somebody else. And I told them that they had to disclose if they were getting paid for that assignment, and they weren't very happy at the idea that they had to disclose that there may be a payment. It's just something that has to happen, guys. Look, especially with the microscope that is on us based on the compensation lawsuit and what we're going through with all of that stuff, the Department of Justice is still looking at realtors as a whole on whether or not our business practices are somehow not legal or not fair to our clients. And the idea that we go out there and some people, not you guys, nobody on this video right now would do something like that. But there are agents out there that we're working in the business with that are doing these things, making money off of somebody else, when our job is to get compensated, and you should get compensated well, but within the rules where that the seller is aware of that compensation that you're getting. If that seller could have made more money and they didn't know about it, you've now broken your fiduciary duty. And whatever happens to you because of that, I feel is fair. So if I buy their house for $650 and they could have sold it for $675, but I'm going to make that money and not tell them, then I deserve whatever happens to me. Whatever issues I run into, I deserve it. Okay, so it was perfect that this week, as I had conversations about this twice about assignments, that we got to this part of the purchase agreement, this week, so we could discuss it. So just know that if I'm doing an assignment, if my intent is to assign this to someone else, now 99% of the time, well, I wouldn't go that far, 90% of the time, the assignments that happen are generally assignments from me as an individual into my corporation, right? Because sometimes there's an investment I want to purchase, or there's a property I want to purchase, and I don't know if I want it to be a personal holding or a business holding. So in the moment, we write the offer as personal instead of getting all the corporation stuff pulled together. And then during the transaction, we're like, you know what? I'd rather that my corporation owns this. Let's do it. Now, just because the seller says, no, I'm not going to let you assign it, doesn't mean that you can't transfer it into your corporation. Once you close, you do grant deeds, you can transfer it in your corporation. It's not that big a deal. It could be done after the fact. But most of the time, this is, hey, I couldn't decide how I wanted to hold it, or maybe I have two corporations and I wrote it under one, and now it looks like, maybe I should write it under the other one because, the money is coming from there. There's legitimate reasons for this to happen. But those people that call themselves wholesalers, this is what they're doing, and I don't know for sure, so I don't want to totally cast aspersions, but I would guess that a majority of those people that are doing wholesaling and doing these assignments are not disclosing to the sellers the additional amount of compensation that exists, which really should be going to them. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the purchase agreement. Any questions about assignments before I move on? Anything? Okay. Let's see. Where do we end up? We were right here. Okay. So now we're in paragraph 3L. 3L is where we start the contingencies and the time periods that both parties have to agree on. Okay. So the first one, 3L1, loan contingency. Now, what you guys have to understand is that the loan contingency is only for the loan. So if, for example, we submit an offer where we remove our inspection contingency and our appraisal contingency, right? Because, there was that crazy time, and I still see it once in a while, where it was like, I got to get my offer accepted. We're competing. The buyers are 100 to 1 for listings. And people were writing offers with either no contingencies, or they were removing their appraisal and inspection and leaving their loan with the belief that their loan was going to be their backstop. Okay. The thing with the loan contingency is it is only going to protect you if the reason you use it is you didn't qualify for the loan any longer. So even if we removed our appraisal contingency, if the property doesn't appraise, and that is the only reason you can't get qualified for the loan contingency doesn't protect you. Okay, so you have to understand that just because you have a loan contingency in place and you don't have an appraisal, you still can't fall back on that loan contingency to cancel and get your deposit back. Okay, keep that in mind. So loan contingency. Here's where the only thing that we're going to look at with this for loan contingency is your time periods, right? We talk about from both angles. From a buyer's side, I want to have a strong offer. If I'm doing something that is less than 30 days in an escrow, right? Where we talked about I'm writing a 21-day escrow. I should actively say, well, then my loan contingency is going to be 14 days or 12 days. I'm going to reduce it because it doesn't make sense. The amount of contracts that I review where people are like, oh, this is a cash offer, so we're doing a 14-day escrow. And then I run through the contract and all their contingencies are still at 17 days. It doesn't make sense. So then you have to think about, if it doesn't make sense, when I get it as listing agent, all I look at is, there's two things I think. Well, this buyer's agent doesn't know what they're doing. They were in a hurry, and that means they're sloppy. And now I have a lot of stuff I have to counter. Because now I have to change all the time periods. I have to counter things because it doesn't make sense. If you want this 2-week escrow, why would your contingencies exist all the way through the close of escrow and really beyond, which is silly, right? So think about it. Think about, does it make sense? And if I'm the listing agent, when I get these offers and I look at these escrow periods, does it make sense? Do the contingency periods and the escrow periods make sense? Because sometimes they might shorten these contingency periods, but they still don't make sense because we're talking about 2 or 3 days prior to close. So make the numbers make sense, okay? So that's the loan contingency. The appraisal. Now, if you don't have a loan contingency, you could check that box if you don't want to have one. If you are fully underwritten and all you're waiting for is the appraisal, you could take the loan contingency off and leave the appraisal contingency going. I wouldn't suggest it, but you could if you wanted to. But the appraisal contingency. Okay, this is where people get confused in paragraph 3L2. This little box in the dollar amount here. The default in the contract says this property must appraise for the purchase price. So if it doesn't appraise for purchase price, then I can use my appraisal contingency to negotiate a new price or to cancel the transaction and move on. That's what the default is. This is if we want to make it a different amount Okay, so for example, I listed my property for $650,000. Okay. And I'm writing an offer over, right? So I look at the listing and it's listed for $650, and my buyer is going to write an offer for $700 and something thousand, right? Because they want to get it. You could say that your appraisal contingency is no longer the purchase price, but the list price. So if I'm listing agent, I should be confident in my list price. So if somebody, I want to say, hey, don't remove your appraisal contingency, right? Like for a buyer, I could say, hey, we're willing to pay the $50,000, right? Difference. List price to offer price. This is how you show you're willing to pay it. Now what you're saying is, as long as it appraises for $650, I'm in. I can't use my appraisal contingency any longer. Right? Does that make sense? So I'm offering $700, but I only need it to appraise for $650. If it appraises for anything over $650, I can't then use my appraisal contingency to extract myself from the transaction. Now, if it appraises for $645 or $630, then yeah, I can walk if you don't want to negotiate the price. So that would be a way as buyer's agent I could show, hey, we're willing to pay the difference. Okay? You could do this in a counter offer essentially as a listing agent saying, look, these people are getting crazy writing these offers over asking. I'll let them have an appraisal contingency because I know they have to do an appraisal because there's a loan. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I listed it for $650. You're offering now $725. I want it to, in order for your appraisal contingency to work, it has to appraise. It can't appraise for no less than the $650, or even give them some more, $675, that I'll let you walk, right? But that's it. I'm not going to give you all the way to $750 because I know the chances are it's not going to appraise for that. But if you're writing a normal offer and all you want is your appraisal contingency to work based on the offer price, then you don't need to do anything. That's what it's already there for. It's saying, if this property appraises for less than the offer price, then we have the right to use our appraisal contingency. That's it. What I would suggest that you guys do for stronger offers is shorten this period of time. Again, listing agents shorten it, but talk to your lender and see what it's taking for turnaround times now on appraisals, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you can't comply. I've seen people put 7 days on there sometimes. I don't think that there's a chance you're going to get your completed appraisal back in 7 days, even getting somebody out. Remember, they can't even order the appraisal until after the buyer signed the disclosures, and that's 3 days minimum, right, for the turnaround on that. So right away, you're already cutting yourself, short with able to do it. I would suggest that 12 is probably, a good amount of time for that appraisal to make sense. Okay. Questions about appraisals before I move on? Okay. Investigation of property. This is your physical inspection and anything you need to find out from the city, permits, things like that. Any kind of reports you may do, any kind of investigation you want to do on the property, this is your time period to do it. Again, that could be done in a much quicker time, so there's nothing wrong with those periods being, 10 days or so. I think it's crazy when people start putting 7. It does get a little, that's a little crazy, unless you have a short, like we talked about, like you have a cash offer and it's a 14-day escrow. Yeah, give them 7 days. That's fine. That's not a big issue. But just understand that 17 days is for them to do everything. And for for their physical inspection, any other inspections that need to get done, and to go look at, things with the city, permits, review those, do their due diligence, all that stuff. Let's see in chat. Do we have to give a copy of the appraisal to the listing agent seller? Good question, and I should have mentioned that when we were on there. So I appreciate you asking me that question. The answer is yes and no. Okay. So if I have a conventional loan, I only have to give a copy of the appraisal to the listing agent slash seller if the property doesn't appraise for the offer price or the price that we agreed upon, right? Where I'm trying to negotiate a different price. If I am a listing agent my recommendation is always part of my counter is, hey, when you remove your loan contingency, you're going to give me a completed copy of the appraisal. I'm going to make that part of the transaction. Okay. But if I'm FHA or VA, it doesn't matter if it appraises or doesn't appraise. I am required to give a copy to the listing agent / seller. Okay. So if you are an FHA or a VA borrower, you cannot withhold the appraisal from the listing agent. Okay. If you are conventional, you are only required to give it to them if it doesn't appraise or if the listing agent has countered you. Okay. Why would we want to copy the appraisal? Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to copy the appraisal. If the property doesn't appraise, you want to see what the reasons are that it didn't appraise. See if they used comparables that you would have used, just so you're prepared going forward to see what the conditions of the appraisal were. So, you know, for example, if it was, hey, if I got the appraisal and it was stuff that had to be repaired and we couldn't come to an agreement on repairs because as seller, I'm not required to do any of those repairs. At least I have it so I could talk to my sellers later and say, hey, these are repairs that need to be done. They're going to come up on other appraisals, things like that. For FHA and VA, once that property appraises, that appraisal is locked to the property for 6 months. So we need to know that, right? So that we're whatever's in that appraisal, we know is going to happen with every FHA and VA buyer going forward. Okay. Veronica's asking in the chat about escalation clauses. I'm not a fan of them. I think that it's a lazy way to write an offer. But an escalation clause is basically saying, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars over whatever your best offer is up into a certain amount. It's, I don't know. It just seems lazy way to write an offer. To try to outbid other people. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter if I already know that if I have my own buyer and you have an escalation clause and it goes to a maximum amount, I'm just going to say, hey, buyer, write your offer at the maximum amount. Let's get it submitted because remember, offers aren't confidential. Let's get it submitted. If it doesn't appraise or we can renegotiate the price, but go from there. Like I could get you out. Now, here's the thing is I have to show everybody that writes an offer with an escalation clause the true proof that I have an offer that exceeds theirs and, you know, that they're escalating the sales price. I just don't like them. I don't think many people use them anymore because there's not the level of competition that existed when they started. So it's not probably something you're going to run into. Let's see. If the appraisal came in higher value, seller would be able to ask for an increase in price anymore. No, they would not. They've already agreed on the price. That's the price. They can't now change it. Okay. Now, if the buyer's agent did, for example, say, oh, well, you know, we need to renegotiate some things, the seller could then go back and say, okay, now that I have this FHA appraisal where I appraised over, now that you're asking me for more this or more that, or you want a credit, I could be like, no, then if you want the credit, the sales price is going to be the appraised value. Once negotiations start on one thing, negotiations are open on everything. Right. So keep in mind, like if I write an offer and I don't ask for any credit, right, and I do ask for my compensation to get the buyer's agent's compensation to get paid, and then throughout the transaction something comes up and we ask for a credit or we ask for repairs, the seller can then go back in the negotiations and say, okay, I will do those repairs or I will provide that credit, but the credit for compensation to your buyer's agent is going to be reduced by the same amount. Same thing with the purchase price. I could say, hey, here's a list of things I want repaired. Terrific. I will repair all of those things, but now the sales price is going to be this much. Once negotiations get opened on one thing, negotiations are open on everything. So that could become an issue if the buyer's agent now wants to negotiate other things like credits or repairs that weren't part of, or needs an extension. That's why it's really important that you guys are on your timelines, because once I have to negotiate an extension, everything now is reopened. So buyer's agent compensation, any credits that have been agreed to, the deposit, right? Once I need the extension where I'm out of contract and I've removed my contingency. If you haven't removed your contingencies, well, you just cancel. You're not going to lose anything. But if you removed your contingencies and you need an extension, and the seller says the only way I'm going to grant an extension is we reduce the commission to your buyer's agent. We remove the credit that I agreed to give you on the repairs. The repairs we agreed to do, we're not going to do. Now that I have the appraisal and I see what the appraised value is, yeah, you can have the extension, but the new sales price is this. All that could happen if you once you ask for an extension. So you got to keep that in mind. I've had a lot of conversations where agents are like, "Hey, we need this is our second extension, and now they're asking us to bring in $10,000 to put in their deposit, to increase the deposit." That's their right. Is it excessive? That's their right. So it's really important that we stay on track with stuff as buyer's agents. If you can't live by the contract that you drafted, the time periods that go into that contract, then you've got to make sure that you bust your ass to get to those time periods so that you don't put yourself in a position where you have to ask for an extension. Because once that extension happens, once you request that extension, if they put conditions on it to grant it to you, you have to live by them or the deal is done. Okay. All right. It's already, let's see. If it's a cash offer, desire to remove all contingencies to get their offer accepted and they go into escrow, if they back out, do they lose their EMD? Yeah. If they've removed all their contingencies, yeah. I mean, there's a very good chance they're going to lose their deposit if they back out. Again, you have to go through dispute resolution and all kinds of things, but yes, it's very good. I appreciate all these questions. I would love that when we're talking about stuff in the class that we try to stick the questions to the paragraphs that we're dealing with, and we'll get to effect of the EMD and stuff on bad faith and removing contingencies. We'll talk about as we get that. But I appreciate the questions. I like that you guys are asking questions because it means you want to learn. It just keep us on topic because classes go long and we don't get far because we do answer questions. So I appreciate it though. I do. All right. So let's stop the share. Let's end there. Any final questions before I let you guys go? Okay. Thank you guys all for being here. I appreciate it. I think I am always blown away that this many people come and listen to me babble on about this most boring topic, but important topic. If you missed any of this, you came on late, you missed the previous classes, they're all on the YouTube channel. You can go back there and take a look at it. This one will be up later today. Again, please like, share, subscribe, do all that stuff. If you know people who aren't looking at it, share this with them, please, because I feel like the more educated the agents are out there that we're dealing with, the easier our transactions are going to be. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate you all. Take care.